Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'm convener of MESEF, which is Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University. We are very fortunate today to have Taye, who is doing his PhD at Deakin University on aid and the politics of aid to Afghanistan. We have timed this seminar, especially so late afternoon in Melbourne, so that we have our partners and other interested colleagues who could join us from Afghanistan elsewhere in the Middle East. So this is going to be our new timetable for our seminars. Safi has been researching aid to Afghanistan for almost 3 years now. And in the course of his research, he has traveled to the region, to Afghanistan. He has participated in international conferences, looking at the politics of aid, looking at how local actors in Afghanistan negotiate aid, and the factors, especially the security factor, that really impact on decision-making. So we are very fortunate to have Safi share his research with us. He is almost completed with the thesis. So I'd like to invite Safi to give us his presentation. Thank you, Safi.
Hello, everyone. And thank you, Professor Shahram, for that very generous introduction. I wish it was almost 3 years, Professor Shahram, unless you're excluding the entire COVID year. It's been almost 4 years. And yes, time does fly. So I'm going to first share my presentation's PowerPoint, and then I'm going to proceed with the all right. So do you get to see my screen? There's something wrong with this.
It's fine, Safi. It's good. Thank you.
Sorry?
It's good.
Yeah, but there's something wrong on my side, which I do not get to. Do you get to see the screen now?
Now we see the screen, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm going to again go back and say thank you all for being here, and on Professor Shahram to have the confidence on my research. I'm going to put the pressure on you that to allow me to present my thesis here, or at least some of the main findings of my research. So I think one of the first things that any researchers must recognize prior to their research journey is to be, at least to a great extent, aware of the possible risks and challenges that they may face during their research. And I thought I covered that by just being an Afghan. I was so wrong, because throughout this thesis, I was constantly challenged and pushed back with different issues around data collection, what kind of data to work with, and what does it really mean to explain donors' relationship with the Afghan government. And I think the second issue that I faced was to understand the complexity of aid in Afghanistan. Is it, of course, a broader topic about aid, foreign aid, and what does it mean? Is it really a white man's burden, as they say? Is it an end to poverty? But regardless of that philosophical questions about foreign aid, we also talk about aid effectiveness. Where does aid work better? In which environments? But here we're talking specifically in the context of aid for reconstruction. So here we talk about donors-recipient relationship. We are adding that extra flavor of politicization of aid. And of course, in the context of Afghanistan, is that concept of security concerns in Afghanistan. So with that kind of background, my research has primarily one main question, which is exploring the factors that actually influence donors-recipient relationship in the context of Afghanistan. But I had to, at some point, look at what era, what time frame I'm looking at. So I wanted to expand to a good number of years that without recent political developments in Afghanistan. So I capped it to 2018. And I think my subsidiary questions are more linked to actually the thesis itself, the fact that what roles security and securitization play in power dynamics of aid negotiations in Afghanistan. And secondly, the idea of economic strategies, sectoral interventions in particular, how do they influence the decision-making process in Afghanistan? And so that is definitely one of the main questions. And this is basically because the scholarships also look at, they say, well, the first step in analyzing an aid negotiation is to develop a clear understanding of ever-changing global and national economic, political, ideological, and institutional context within which donors and recipients define their preferences and select their strategies. End of quote. So that shows that if somebody wants to look at the concept of negotiations, it's not just a normal give and take. It's a lot more. It's more complex, multi-layered, and of course, it's much more complex in state building, agenda or process. So for those of you who might not be very familiar with the context of Afghanistan, I must say that the history of Afghanistan and foreign aid, and of course, Afghanistan and insecurity does not start with 2001. Afghanistan has a long history of dependency on foreign aid since its establishment as a modern state in 1880. And all the way up to the interwar period, Afghanistan was very much trying to play, in a sense, use its strategic locations as a bargaining chip to attract foreign aid supports, either what was from the British India or from the Soviets or from the Germans during the interwar period. And it went all the way later on to with the rise of communism, which I think in the 70s, then foreign aid did not just become the fact that foreign aid is coming to the country, but there's also foreign troops are coming into the country. And at that period, which is during the proxy wars and at the time, aid was not just used only for construction, for reconstructing the country, but actually for the destruction of the country, because each groups were being funded by different groups in the region and internationally. So it changed the whole dynamic of aid, the relationship between the Afghan government and foreign aid. We, of course, know more about the rise of Mujahideen and how much the United States was actually funding the groups. And the rise of the Taliban, of course, we have the grand intervention, as I call it, or quote unquote, we will call it the invasion in 2001, which, if you look at that as a historical timeline, what really defined Afghanistan as a state is just a weak and fragile and often a failed state. The level of aid dependency has been really, really significant. And then it's a fragmented society as well, because these factors impact how aid packages were, in a sense, were created and drafted for Afghanistan in 2001, arguably, and many donors did not have that kind of understanding, if we want to be very frank and honest. And I think here it's much more clear to look at where Afghanistan stood before 2001 and after that in relation to foreign aid. And we see that the surge of aid allocated to Afghanistan, this is only ODA by most donors. And on the right side of the right table, which is very difficult to actually get a clear indication of what the security index or security severity index. So I just relied mainly on UCDP data on the number of security incidents. So I had to, because these are national, try to one by one find it where these security incidents happen. But this is the overall the number of security incidents in the country. Here, of course, I look at also provincial data as well, but I think for this purpose here is not very relevant. Now, so what really happened after 2001 is this idea of finding the right mechanisms of aid delivery, the modalities. And I think two very important decisions were made at a time, whether we want to go back to whether it was a request of the Afghan government or it was a donor's mandate of having the provincial reconstruction teams, the PRTs, also known as dividing Afghanistan between different regions and regional commands, and 28 provinces were given to different regional commands, and each of them were, in a sense, in charge of these civil military engagements, focusing both on the security, often comes with the counterinsurgency ideas, and also delivering aid at the time. And of course, the idea of focusing a bit of aid on the on-budget. So now the question of on-budget and off-budget, to have a clear definition, is that on-budget would be directly at the discretion of the Afghan government, although it's under the World Bank or the UNDP's management, but it is at the discretion of the Afghan government. The off-budget is basically donors delivering the aid directly. And that is kind of was mandated by the PRT. And that's what one of the main arguments is, that when we have this securitization approach, donors do tend to move some of it, or a significant volume of their aid, to their geographical areas, as I will be discussing shortly. But what this PRTs and the civil military engagements they did was not just to the focus that they had on the security sector itself, but also how it affected the overrun costs in Afghanistan, overrun costs of projects. Projects becomes more expensive because they are very, very much prone to shocks, security shocks in the country. It's the idea that how donors even operate in Afghanistan. Do they have direct access to the ground, or is actually they do it through the remote management, which is all of these are discussed in my research. But here I just wanted to make sure that I spill this out, that with the idea of provincial reconstruction teams, a great emphasis was given to the security objectives by every donor, and specifically as I examine with Australia and Germany. Now, if we look at specific cases, which I look at Australia and Germany, of course, as a small donor and a big donor, Australia being one of the smaller donors in Afghanistan in the number 8 and 9 usually, and Germany between number 2 and number 3. So these are it changes and varies over time. If you look at Australia's ODA in general, it's kind of followed the same trend that the overall ODA to Afghanistan had the map. But on the provincial level, we see that a significant volume of Australian aid within Afghanistan was given to Uruzgan. And of course, there are some caveats with the data. These are according to the most authoritative set of data provided by the Afghan Ministry of Finance. And there is, of course, this idea that how much of aid was allocated to national projects and how much of that was given to specific localities. And of course, in the case of Australia, there's a lot of focuses, or has been, on Uruzgan since 2010, specifically after the Dutch PRT left and Australia kind of became they inherited the province that has been one of the most insecure and needy, I would say, provinces in Afghanistan. Similar trends and analysis can be made also on Germany, but with the Germans, of course, over the past few years, their aid commitment has been more consistent. However, at the provincial level, again, we see that there are some pockets of aid has been focused by the Germans, and these are mainly provinces that the German troops they've been present in Afghanistan. So again, we see that there is a very specific focus on these localities. And why is that very important in the concept of negotiations? Because one of the main concepts, or one of the main issues between the Afghan government and its donors have been the idea of pushing donors to have more national projects, to don't focus only on specific areas, to have projects in other provinces. And the resistance from donors is basically because the idea that their headquarters do not give them the green light to go and go beyond those areas. So that kind of shows where is the main challenge with the Afghan government when it comes to sector, when it comes to geographical aid allocation. I'll be discussing this further, but just to look at some of the data for now. Now, that is one aspect of aid securitization, how that more or less limited the scope of negotiations between the Afghan government and its donors. The second topic is this idea of sectoral or economic development in Afghanistan. I try to, from the data, from the interviews I conducted, I try to put a few categories of each actors believe that these are the main drivers beyond their sectoral decisions on which sectors to intervene. Mainly donor headquarters, they talk about this idea of comparative advantage. For example, the Germans emphasis on the energy sector, for example, or the Australians to dry land farming as an example. But there's also this idea that there's a lot of consultations happening between donors headquarters and their implementing agencies. For example, KfW, they are expert and specialized in specific types of projects in specific sectors. They work on long-term projects. They do not establish like 1 or 2 years projects. So they constantly communicate with their headquarters. And that becomes another factors on donor selection of specific sectors. Similarly with Australians, which is a bit different because Australia, after dismantling AusAid, they did not really have an implementing agency, but they work with partner organizations such as Save the Children or ICRC or World Vision. So their input becomes so vital in which sectors do they intervene. There's also this next layer of private sectors, and private sectors are again important contributors or determinants of which sectors donors are intervening. Now, going back to this idea of donors, Germany's involvement in the energy sector, we data show that there is a lot of emphasis on involvement of Siemens, for example, in the projects. And that's just one example. There are plenty of consulting firms that are being part of the aid delivery packages. But of course, as over the past few years, the discussion and the literature also guide us, we know that aid allocation is not just completely a donorship. There's this idea of ownership and recipients' input as well into aid allocation. And that's where mainly the Afghanistan National Development Strategy comes in, established in 2008, which basically provided the guideline on which sectors are really the priorities of the Afghan government. And so that becomes the Afghan government itself. And at the bottom, but also at the base of this is the idea of community-based development. This is, of course, not within my research, the community development, but I really encourage whoever is interested in aid negotiations in Afghanistan to focus on, to look at the donors' types of negotiations with the local communities, because I think that would be a very interesting topic as well. Again, given if somebody has the green light to actually go and work in Afghanistan if the security situation allows. Just to have a comparison between on-budget and off-budget sectoral aid allocation. And here we can see that there's a lot more aid going off budget. There are more donors, sectoral interventions as well. In a sense, they not just did the gap filling for the Afghan government, but there's also been the idea of more diversity of approaches, more diverse portfolios by many of the donors in this context. And now, again, going back to the specific examples of Australia and Germany, here, again, going back to the OECD data, remember I just talked about this comparative advantage, but we can see that data shows that it's not just 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 sectors that donors intervene. There are a broad number of projects, sectors that they're involved. And it's not just conflict, peace, and security, which would make aid more securitized, but there's also more layered decision-making in donors' headquarters, or on which sector should they intervene. There's also this idea that really how much of aid is actually being allocated within Afghanistan. Here I can just show one example, the idea of scholarships in Afghanistan, that project that both Germany and Australia have had. And these are basically awards that are given to the Afghans who are studying in Australia, or when they move to Australia. And this is something that one may ask, is it really the overseas development assistance if the aid is actually being dispersed within donor countries? Again, this is a broader topic on political economy of foreign aid. And of course, mine is more about focusing on where does it leave the Afghan government in terms of negotiation power and power dynamics in the relationship. Similarly, with the Germans, again, the number of projects are diverse. And according to one senior officials that I spoke to, they agreed that there are pushes from the headquarters that they should intervene, have a diverse portfolio. These are what the domestic audience, they want to hear, that donors are intervening in different sectors. Of course, there are some priorities, and that's where the coalition, in a sense, more or less between the private sectors and implementing agencies and the governments happen. But there are also other projects that they kind of tend to intervene just because it looks good. And on top of my head, focusing on gender inequality would be one of them, a sector that has been focused by many donors, and often there are little coordinations on that one. Now, to bring all of this together, now here, this is something that I try to develop to look at the negotiation spaces. The underlying argument here is that the donors and the Afghan governments, they do negotiate, they do meet, and there are different platforms for their discussions, starting from pledging conferences. That's where the Afghan government actually shines and manages to get aid, at least some pledges and commitments. But there are also discussions and negotiations at different level, at the DCD, or Development Cooperation Dialogues, at heads of agency meetings. There are also government-to-government negotiations, specifically in the case of Germany, that where the Afghan governments and the Germans, they meet every year, senior officials, either they meet in Kabul or in Germany. Actually, they alternate every year. But if we look at what really drives these factors of donors, geographical and sectoral aid allocation as two main factors to examine the negotiation process, is this idea of aid securitization, which limits donors' sectoral geographical expansion, and donors' whole of government approach, which basically brings all these different actors together to deliver a package of aid to a fragile state. On the other side, you have an Afghan government who is suffering from insecurity from the very first day. That also has a lot of social fragmentations. It definitely, aid dependency is one of its features. Corruption, weak governance, and of course, political uncertainty being its features over the past 20 years, despite over 90 billion of aid allocated for the reconstruction of the country. So if I want to just look at the main findings, I would say that securitization has limited the scope of negotiations between the Afghan government, because not only the donors as a broader different term, but also their agencies are also mandated to work in specific geographical areas. Certainly the securitization has led to the whole concept of PRT, which again takes away the aid that is supposed to be for Afghanistan. It becomes a tool for donors to be directly delivered, and that's the off budget. And the Afghan government has constantly been pushing its donors to decrease their off-budget aid delivery. As a good friend of mine, Bijan, he argued that this undermines government's legitimacy. But it's also this idea that donors are kind of left in that conundrum of what to do in a very insecure and highly volatile environment. So not to sympathize with donors, but there is no other option for them. The idea of on budget has its own risks, as I argue also in my thesis as well. But this idea that donors, they try to, in a sense, quote unquote, survive in a very hostile environment. But also what aid securitization does, it decreases that kind of accountability and reporting in a sense, because once the reports are all about security, then the whole question about what are we really doing in Afghanistan becomes important in donor headquarters. And that's what most donors, they tend not to show that, but in a sense, paint that with numbers of sectors. For example, they intervene could be 20 sectors every year. However, some of them are just $2,000 for a specific project, and that's it. With this idea of whole of government approach, and this also is another factor that it kind of decreases, or it's another debilitating factor in the power dynamics of aid negotiations, because aid packages is delivered to a country like a fragile state like Afghanistan, with many stakeholders already having a say in it. And this, of course, leads to the fragmentation of aid, and that we saw that from the sectoral interventions from which sectors donors are intervening. But it's also the idea of aid commercializations, the fact that aid becomes not just a means for security interest, but also an economic and political interest. And of course, these need to be a lot more expanded, and that's where the future research will definitely have room in this topic. And I would like to thank everybody for being here, and leave you all with this comment that one of my participants made. And I think it's a very interesting quote, saying that there was an overwhelming optimism in the beginning that donors could turn Afghanistan, if not Switzerland, at least Albania. And the sentence ended with, here we are now. And here we are now, really, with whatever is happening in Afghanistan. So that would be the end of my presentations. And I am happy to take any and all questions, comments, feedback, and criticisms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Safiullah. Fantastic presentation. Well, yes, if you stop sharing your screen, I will be able to see raised hands. People are clapping. Fantastic. Emojis of clapping. So if you like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function. I will ask you to unmute yourself to raise your question. Okay, well, since people are thinking about their questions, let me ask the first. Mahmoud has a question already. Go ahead, Mahmoud.
Okay, Shahram John, you can ask and then I will continue, because my question is not just direct. Okay.
I saw Mustafa Najib as well had a question, so.
Okay.
Okay. Let's, I just keep it after a few others because it's not directly relevant, so.
All right, so you go to Mustafa.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Shahram and ADI, for providing this opportunity for community members like me to join as well. I know a lot of academics here, and my question is probably not too deep in terms of the theory and the academic discussions, but more like one of the things I've always heard about aid and international aid is the golden rule about do no harm. So whatever you do, if you're not making it any better, please don't make it any worse, is what I understand, any aid should be. However, if looking overall, the overall of what has happened in the last 20 years in Afghanistan, since what Safi described as the grand intervention. So can we say that whatever has happened in terms of money going to Afghanistan, has it done any harm than good? Is the harm been worse, actually more than the good that it has? And if I can refer to one example, it would be in the case of Australia, which is the focus here. the money, the hundreds of millions of dollars that Australian taxpayers have provided to the government to give to whatever work they have done in Uruzgan, is the villages around Uruzgan a better place today than it was when the Australians got in there? That'll be my question.
Thank you. Go ahead, Safi.
Well, I think the do no harm principle, Najib John, thank you for that question. I would say, first of all, I think that's, again, goes back to the whole principle of foreign aid. Do no harm works not only in development, but also in humanitarian sectors. And I think as an Afghan, definitely I might have certain reservations. Certainly there are progresses in Afghanistan. I think no one can deny what Afghanistan was in 2001 and Afghanistan is today. And here we're not talking about just the political settings, and we're not talking about the number of security incidents, but in terms of just economic development itself. The fact that Afghanistan has definitely progressed since then, especially in the area of education, healthcare, and that is very evident from the life expectancy, the literacy rate. And if you want to look at some other factors, such as democracy and all that, but certainly these are what we really want to say, that these are positive impacts. And now, how much of that can be directly attributed to foreign aid is definitely a different question. If you want to go back to the idea of, unfortunately, I have never been to Uruzgan, Mustafa, but I would say, based on some of the conversations that I had with my participants, even within Uruzgan, as you say, there are different villages, and donors, sometimes they had to focus on one specific village and leave the other one just the way it is. This concept of orphan aid is very, very common in Afghanistan. And it was just a matter of convenience of where donors were actually dispersing their aid. So I would say that maybe overall, all villages are better these days. Now, if you're going to attribute that to foreign aid, I am not going to make that claim, because that is the question of whether foreign aid works or not. And that is a completely different topic.
Can you explain what orphan aid is?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically the idea that some areas are left out from the allocation of aid. For example, if there are two villages or two provinces, and one province gets to get more aid and the other one gets less, one becomes the orphan who doesn't get much.
Thanks so much, Safi. That was an excellent, description of how things are. And I think you're right in terms of, I saw in your presentation that you've also described it as, that's what they use as buying the hearts and minds. I would say it's the opposite of carrot and stick. So basically, if you live in a province, in a village where there is a lot of violence, a lot of security issues, we need to come and buy your hearts and your minds so that you don't do any more of those things. What that means for me in my village, in one of the provinces in there, is that if I'm not doing anything bad, if I'm not blowing up some roads, if I'm not doing some bombings or some shootings, no one is going to pay attention to me. It's the opposite of carrot and stick. So as an Afghan village person, what do I think? What am I going to do to get some attention? I need to blow some places up. And that's why, the things changed, the whole story, like looking at your graph from 2007 and 8 upwards, when they brought the counter-insurgency strategy, things kind of changed, because it's the buying and hearts and minds. So how can I get you to buy my hearts and mind if I'm an Afghan village man? I have to do some shooting.
Thank you, Mustafa.
Sorry, I'm just a bit emotional about it, but obviously.
That's important. Thanks very much for raising it. Other questions? Yes, Siranjoy, go ahead, unmute.
Oh, thanks, Safi. I'm quite sure that someone else wanted to ask a question before me. I think that was Mahmoud.
That's okay, go ahead.
You sure?
Yes.
Right, okay. Safi, thanks for that. Very interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading your dissertation and the book when it comes out. Question on your findings, and particularly the whole of government approach findings. It occurs to me that it's complementary. Your findings are quite complementary to recent critiques of the whole of government kind of approach that the UN has been undertaking, particularly in the context of complex emergencies, i.e. Yemen and the reconstruction in Mosul. And I'm just wondering whether you've engaged with that literature, emerging as they are, at all, because you find there's a lot of similarities between your critiques and this critical literature that's emerging, and particularly how Elise Grande, in her capacity as whatever she was in Mosul, in Iraq, and then in Yemen, has conducted reconstruction and obviously negotiated the flow of on and off budget aid. So I'm just wondering whether you've engaged with that at all, and how that may have informed your own work in the Afghan context. I'm sure I'll have other questions, but I can ask them if we have more time.
Well, thank you, Sanjay, for that question. Honestly, no, I have not engaged with that. And I think basically within different contexts, of course, now we're talking about post-reconstruction, post-conflict reconstruction, there have been different strategies on how to even implement. And I think if I put forward this concept of whole of government approach to even some of the agencies here and say, well, this is what has, what your whole of government approach has resulted, they might even contest that. Because this whole concept about whole of government approach is something that is supposed to be within donor countries to provide their aid in a more comprehensive way as a package to fragile states. This idea that the whole of government approach, or the 3D development, diplomacy and defense, was supposed to be fitting that characteristics of a fragile state, which are suffering from insecurity, weak institutions, and legitimacy. But what we see, or at least in the case that in Australia and Germany, is that these descriptions of whole of government approach, what it has resulted in having more inputs into the whole decision-making process. Now, I wouldn't know exactly how would that work if the UN is doing that, if UN has a specific agendas of securitizing aid. But I do believe there might be some differences in how UN peacekeepers, for example, would deliver aid or securitize aid than actually states would do that. That is my only comments right now, but I definitely would love to look at that, the practices that they are doing in Iraq and in Yemen, because I think that would be perhaps the difference. Because if we look at what the peacekeepers are doing and how would they perhaps securitize aid, could be a little bit different than how the United States, Germany are doing it, or even including even Australia. But I would be more than happy to have a conversation with you on this, and I would definitely want to pick up your opinions on that.
Okay, thank you. I think, Mahmoud, we're going to go to your question now.
Oh, okay. Safijan, thank you very much. I really enjoy your talk. I know it's not one of your focus areas, but do you have any idea how Chinese are doing in this regard? I mean, and if they are putting any kind of, considerable, amount of money, or if they do, in which normally areas and fields they go, and what are the interests and how they work, because they have this idea that developments comes first and then other. So, and later, if you have question, I will ask about another question about, if we have time, I will ask another question about technology, but for now, thank you.
Well, thank you, Mahmoud. And to be honest, this is not the first time I've been asked about China. And I think it's really important, because every time we talk about, you think of this rivalry, what the Chinese are doing in Afghanistan. clearly that's not part of my research because I'm looking at ODA and also the idea of comparing Australia and Germany. So, however, from my personal knowledge of the Chinese involvement in Afghanistan, they are involved in a lot of constructions, and of course in the mining sector. But I was also I was very interested to see that before yesterday, a signing agreement was an agreement was signed between an Australian company and the Afghan government. I forgot the name of it. It was actually on 3 days ago only, that they signed the ownership of all mining projects in Afghanistan for the next 5 years. I don't know how the Chinese would definitely react to that one, but that is something interesting to look at. I should have definitely saved the name, at least name of the company, but they signed the agreement just 3 days ago. And I think maybe that is, I don't know, maybe Australia and China are going to compete now in Afghanistan because not enough competition forces are already in Afghanistan. So let's have one more, why not? But I think in terms of China, definitely China has a larger strategic, I would say mainly maybe driven by economic interests, that hunger that China has for the whole connectivity and regional connectivity with the investment that is going to have on Central Asia. I think these are some of the interests that perhaps the Chinese would have. I am not going to speculate any further, but I think there are definitely clear evidences of Chinese involvement in the mining sector, especially.
Yes, Abbas, go ahead.
Hi everyone, thank you very much, Safi. Sorry, I missed some 5-6 minutes at the beginning of the presentation because of technical problem. I just have a question. There was reports in the past that some of these aids just allocated for powerful man and provincial level to provide security for donors at the provincial level. For example, in the case of Australia, there's one of well-known example is Safiullah Khan and some other big names that they provide security and actually aid allocated not for people and construction, what is explained in that concept of aid securitization, but this directly allocated somehow like a bribe for those people to provide security. So what is your opinion on that types of issues and how it impacted the aid and the relationship between donors and the Afghan government to negotiate its allocation and all at the same times making more powerful those people, and also they are accused for abusing their power against other people, which is which also pushed more insecurity in the country. So what do you think about that? What is your finding on that types of issues there in the education and the securitized context? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Abbas, for that question. I think there are definitely some restrictions that I had to have on how much I'm going to deal with the data and what kind of reports I'm going to look at. So definitely when I talk about actors being involved in the decision-making and the negotiations, I'm looking at the negotiation between the Afghan government and donor governments. And in these kind of instances, there aren't many cases that you see a strong man also sitting in the negotiation room or in the discussion room, although they could be, I don't know. But in terms of how donors are delivering their aid, definitely that's one of the issues, that who are their intermediaries, as I say. Sometimes it could be an international organization such as Save the Children, and sometimes could be just an individual. Similar criticism were also made on the Germans on their involvement in the Balkh province, their work with the Tom Ahmed Noor at the time, and even some other regional commanders at the time. So even though I mentioned some of these to show that the complexity of aid securitization in Afghanistan, I do not deal with the specific cases like this. I look at how more or less how much aid has gone to the security sector. Secondly, how does it impact the overrun cost? And that's where some of these examples, they come in. Because of the insecurity, donors, they have to either halt their projects or bribe someone so they can get the project done. And that is not just with the individuals, it also could be with the government sometimes. Because of some insecurity reports, the Afghan governments decide that they want to shut down a site and donors cannot implement the project, then they have to go back to the donor, to the Afghan government. They try to promise something for the next year or for the next time, and that's where they get the green light to go back. And then I look at how securitization in a sense affects the entire duration of projects, how projects are being implemented in the country. And that's where comes the idea of remote management and who become donors' partners. Private companies, individuals, in a sense, anyone that can just deliver the aid, whatever the cost be. But specifically in that, I think that would be very, very interesting, but maybe not definitely part of my question or my research. I hope I answered the question. I hope so.
Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Surenjay, did you say you have a follow-up question? You might go to your follow-up question, and then I'll get the chance to ask my question.
Fantastic. It's not a follow-up question per se, but more like a dialogue. So if no one's going to begrudge me this dialogue, I think, Safi, there's a real opportunity over here for you, for your dissertation and the eventual product post your dissertation to contribute into certain literatures. So for example, in Bijan's case, obviously he's making an argument about state-society relations by looking at aid. And I'm just wondering, what conversation you can contribute to, particularly in light of your twin findings. And I'm thinking you can say a whole lot about, you know, in terms of a critique of liberal peace building. And your findings would suggest precisely that, what the ontologies are of aid decision-making, which you are unpacking to a certain extent, and how those ontologies of aid and aid decision-making impact negotiations between Afghan government and their donor counterparts. And in other words, and this is why I asked you my earlier question of, you know, have you looked at some of the other literatures, more recent literatures, not the historical aid literature on Afghanistan or elsewhere, which is really problematizing this whole of government approach to aid and reconstruction. And I really think that you can add to that narrative by looking at the Afghan case and from your findings for precisely those reasons. There's great synergy and alignment over here between your particular unpacking of a particular case study and the broader liberal critique of aid specifically. Yeah, sorry, the broader critique of liberal aid specifically.
Thank you.
Thank you, 100%. Definitely, I think it's certainly something that I will, I mean, I have, as you said, I have dealt with that, but maybe just explicitly fleshing it out that this is the contribution. And of course, engaging with parallel, maybe reconstruction efforts that are happening. So I just noted everything that you said. So hopefully I'll be using that part of it, at least in my thesis as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Safi. Well, I think as the chair, I get the prerogative of asking the last question. And that's something to do with the power dynamics and power relationship. Because when we talk about negotiation, it assumes that there is parity in power relations. But the fact of the matter is that the Afghan government and donors have different powers. And in many ways, I suspect, and I think that's your argument, that the donors have much greater power in the way aid is delivered in Afghanistan. And that the case you mentioned earlier regarding allocation of funds, allocation of aid to geographical territories, to provinces, as opposed to the central government's preference for central aid delivery. I think that probably captures that power dynamic. And I wonder if you could just talk to us a bit more as to why there is a preference for example, in Australia case in Uruzgan, why there is that preference for the geographic demarcation of aid?
Oh, thank you, Professor Shahram. So I think now, again, going back to the power dynamics and that whole discussion about the what you call the demarcation of provinces. First of all, the whole idea of PRTs was just a very much request of President Karzai at a time asking international forces to expand to different provinces outside of Kabul, because he very much feared that the strongmen around the country are going to undermine his power. So he wanted to, in one way or another, he wanted the international forces who are his allies to be all around the country to provide that security and development, but at the same time, also to make sure that his power is maintained. So now, if we are going to argue this, that was this a request of the Afghan government, so the power with the Afghan government, or it was actually the whole process after that, the Afghan officials have been keep asking donors to expand beyond those areas and they are not doing it. I think in terms of why donors are really protecting their assets in those locations is just because, as according to one of my participants, is that they do not want to spread themselves too thin. And that is one of the main arguments. Afghanistan is a very, very hostile and a very insecure environment. And spreading yourself too thin in a country like that, it ends up being not just ineffective, but also inefficient. The costs of projects are going to rise. And that's where donors are going to have problems in the country. Sometimes their projects within a specific locations are being delayed for 1 year or 2 years because of insecurity. How about having it all around the country? So I think that becomes the donors, in a sense, protection to focus on specific locations. And in terms of power dynamics, here the Afghan government, they want the aid to be more at their own discretion, but also there's a matter of how much of trust are between donors and the Afghan government, especially with corruption, especially with the idea that how the Afghan government actually is able to use the money. Sometimes donors even argue that the Afghan government is not able to even finish the money that we already give them, which is 20 to 30% of the whole aid. They argue that the Afghan government is not able to finish that efficiently. So donors are, in a sense, they're more efficient, more capable of finishing the aid. That's what they're doing it themselves. So it's just that's where all this discussion comes about. What factors are actually behind these, beyond these negotiations? And that's where I find that, well, first of all, the idea of full securitization is something that pushes donors to focus on their security objectives in the country. And in terms of sectoral intervention is what actually being given to them. The dictation that you need to go a specific, like invest in specific sectors, that becomes a political decision, a commercial decisions, aligned with the security objectives. So it's not just a matter of them only supporting one province. I will tell you an example. For example, one of the participants that I had working for one of the German agencies, and they constantly negotiate and argue with their own donor ministries that please allow us to go work in other provinces because they care about commercial and about profit. And the donors are not allowing them to go. They're not allowing their implementing agencies to go and work in for example, in Herat. So Herat is not one of the main focuses of Germany. And it's because of that mandate. Because if we have projects if the Germans have projects in Helmand, and if something happens to the personnel, then they are responsible to answer to their domestic audience. And that is that's one of the main questions why donors are very hesitant to go beyond that geographical boundaries or demarcations.
Thank you so much, Safiullah. Fascinating presentation. And it's such an important area of research and study, central to the reconstruction of Afghanistan. And we're all hopeful that soon we will see Afghanistan in peace and prosperity. So please join me in thanking Safi for his nice presentation. online clapping.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you are not on our mailing list, please send us a quick email. We can add you to our mailing list so you'll be notified of our all future webinars. Have a good time. Thank you.
Thank you, Safi Jan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.